was from time to time focusing on the works of a particular author. And on this particular occasion, we've decided to focus on the works of Michael Jerryson. Not only because they're good and interesting, but because of the kind of importance that he has played in the field of religion and violence, and particularly in the creation of this unit, this section of the AAR on the comparative approaches to the study of religion and violence. One of the first organizers. He's put so much time and energy into bring it together and to bring into fruition so many interesting panels that it seemed more than appropriate for us to focus tonight on the works of Michael Jerryson. Now, I have to confess that I've known Michael ever since, I feel like ever since he was a little boy. I never had kids of my own, so I feel like my students are my children. And I've told Michael, as I've told Jamel, that regardless of how old you guys get, you're always kids to me. and I'm so proud of you. You know, you've done so well. You're growing up, and you're actually teaching and wonderful things. So I'm so pleased and proud. In Michael's case, it was almost daunting when he came to us as a graduate student because he'd already published a book. He'd already done a book on Mongolian monks and the revival of Buddhism in Mongolia. And my first thought is, well, what do we have to teach this guy? I mean, why is he here? He should already be out teaching. But he was modest, and he pretended at least that we knew some things that he didn't, and there was something yet to learn. And he turned out to be a wonderful junior colleague and a wonderful graduate student at UC Santa Barbara. And I've enjoyed so much working with Michael since then on a number of projects, including some edited books, for which Michael did more work than me, but we shared the credit. That's something you do when you're a senior faculty, right? And, I'm proud to have done that with Michael. And then to watch this kind of trajectory of studies over the years, the several books now that have come out on the general topic of Buddhism and violence. I'd ask, when we're putting this panel together, I asked Michael to put together a short reflective paper. So he put together a 6-page paper, which I'm not going to read, but it is worth reading at some point. And it kind of details his narrative of how he came into moving from one study to the other, and how he began in northern Thailand looking at the role of the monks, and then hearing about this turmoil in the southern part of the country between Buddhists and Muslims, and it being projected and described not only in Thailand but around the world as a problem with Muslims, that Muslim violence. And then Michael went down there to see what was going on, and lo and behold, the Buddhists were not all that innocent, as it turned out. The story turned out to be more complicated, and that the issue of violence and religion seemed to be something that is a part of all faiths, not just the Abrahamic faith. And it was something, as a scholar, not because he wanted to belittle or diss Buddhism in any way whatsoever. He devoted his life's work to it. He loved Buddhism. He loved the monks. He was attracted to the tradition. But to be honest and to share with the community of scholars and to the wider public the fact that there are some sort of family resemblances that are the same in all religious traditions. And among them is the relationship of religion and violence, was something he took upon himself as something very personal and important. And then there was one other thing. In the very opening paragraph of this statement that Michael wrote, he wrote something that really rather surprised me as a scholar. I expected it to be what, in fact, most of it was. It's kind of his intellectual trajectory. But he began with something even more personal in his why he embraced the kind of topics that he did. And if, Michael, if you don't mind, if I'll read just one sentence from your opening statement, that he said, "In my academic career, whenever I have perceived suffering and a lack of awareness to suffering, I felt compelled to use my privileges to make this suffering more visible." What a remarkable thing to say. I mean, scholars were supposed to be dispassionate and uninterested in human frailties. We're supposed to study things only because of their intellectual interest and their fascination, their curiosity. And I'm sure Michael has been attracted to the subject for all of those reasons. But also there's a very human level to this, a very human and humane touch to be concerned about the suffering of people and the awareness and perception of suffering and the importance of sharing that with the world. So, Michael, I want to thank you with that insight. It made me think about my own work and the degree to which I should be conscious of this as a factor and a feature in the sort of work that I do as well. Well, we have a wonderful panel here to discuss the works of Michael Jerryson and his relationship to the field of religion and violence generally, in the field of Buddhist studies. Let me say a word about each one of our panel members so I don't have to reintroduce them later on. And I'll do so in the order in which they'll be speaking. Susan Hayward is with the United States Institute of Peace. She's also working on a PhD at Georgetown. She does work on peace and conflict studies, and particularly interested in Buddhist-Christian relations and the whole issue of political Buddhism. The second member of our panel is Chris Queen, whom I've known forever, I think. Chris and I share an interest in peace and conflict studies and a particular interest in Gandhi. That's gone on for, by the way, I was in South Africa this last year and actually slept in the house where Gandhi lived in Johannesburg.
Actually, as an Ambedkarite, I'm kind of opposed to Gandhi.
Well then, as I am an Ambedkarite myself, but it makes me even more interested in Gandhi. It doesn't mean that I like everything he's done. In any event, Chris is at the Harvard Theological Seminary, works on Buddhism and engaged Buddhism and world religions. Abby Kulitz was a student of mine at Youngstown, where she began her work on gender and religion, and she's continuing it now at the University of Indiana, concerned particularly with the issues of gender and Islam and Christianity, but she also at one point did a project on gender and Buddhism in relationship to Christianity and Islam. Alicia Turner is at York. Worked on Buddhism, particularly in Burma and Myanmar, historically, and I'm sure with great interest in the contemporary situation, tragic situation in that country. And then finally, Eric Davies at Macalester, who's also an expert on Southeast Asia Buddhism, working primarily on Cambodia. So what a wonderful cast of characters. Look forward to fairly brief comments from each one of you. If you start straying on too long, I may clear my throat and start tugging on your sleeve. But Susan, begin our discussion.
Great to be here to share my ode to Michael Jerryson, the man in the scholarship. My starting point might be slightly different from the others in that I habit the world of policy and practice at the U.S. Institute of Peace, the practice of peace building generally around the world, but also in Southeast Asia. And I want to speak to Michael's contributions to the world of policy and practice, as well as to the world of scholarship a bit, because I do don that hat occasionally. And in all of this, what I want to celebrate most is Michael's way of seeing the world, and the religions and the people in it for what they are, for who they are. Complicated, salty, and sweet. And to appreciate them as they are and who they are as fully human. Of course, the most obvious way is the way in which Michael has helped burst the bubble of romantic protection that has often shrouded the study of Buddhism in the West. Western Buddhist studies scholars, in their celebration of the tradition, have sometimes been its biggest evangelists, writing the script that has helped drive its spread. Buddhism is different. It's not like those irrational, doctrinally policing, inflexible, and violent monotheistic faiths. Buddhism is rational, peaceful, modern, or postmodern, as it were. And Buddhism provides the solution to what ills our modern world. It provides the solutions to stress, to parochialisms, to self-serving nature. Whether or not there's truth in those arguments, Michael's work took a different tack. Without disparaging Buddhism in its idealized form and what Buddhist ideas and actors can and have contributed to the greater good, Michael hasn't been afraid to point out Buddhism and Buddhists' own contribution to direct structural and cultural forms of violence. In so doing, he has rendered the tradition and the people who comprise it more fully human, both salty and sweet, complicated and real. This rendering of Buddhism human is ultimately a good thing, because Buddhism is finally no thing other than those who construct it, sustain it, reimagine it, and reinterpret it. And to construct it as an idol, of course, is a form of Orientalism, a flattening and rendering of entire people into an exoticized, unidimensional state, a project that has more to do with the West and its desires, fears, and hopes than about Buddhism itself. Now, many of us know that Michael's work to reveal that while Buddhism is not essentially violent, neither is it essentially peaceful, was not always welcomed. I'm sure Michael has taken some hell for it, from those I'm not fully aware of, from those who want to dismiss or disavow any violence associated with the tradition as simple, imaginary, or apocryphal. But I do not doubt that your work has been part of a constructive evolution of Buddhist studies in the West, Michael. And I also have no doubt that you love Buddhism and the people who comprise it. Complicated, messy, contradictory, idealistic, self-protective humans. The humans that comprise all religious traditions. Your seeing their saltiness and their sweetness does not make you appreciate them any less, au contraire. That much is clear from those who read your work and for those who see you work. Michael's work to bring Buddhism and Buddhists, with all their ambivalencies, into the study of religion and violence has rendered that field of study stronger. In the most obvious way, by pulling against the hyper-focus on Islam and violence, as Mark mentioned, in the scholarship that has much to do with imperial geopolitics and, disturbingly, feeds global and local patterns of violence. Of course, we need look no further than southern Thailand itself to see evidence of that phenomenon. That is, because armchair analysts of violence and religion, and even the experts, have been trained to recognize the patterns of religious support for violence amongst Muslims, that comes more readily than acknowledgement of distinctly Buddhist patterns of violence. But of course, this only feeds the dangerous narrative that Islam is essentially more violent, and it can reinforce the very narratives used to justify a-religious and so rational and ordered violence against Muslims by Buddhists and others. This research has contributed to new and different ways of thinking generally about religious belief, impulse, practices, and structures of authority and how they intersect with violence. Precisely because of the fact that Buddhism functions in ways both similar and different from Abrahamic traditions. As I said at the outset, perhaps one thing I can speak to in particular is the way that Michael has sought to engage with and navigate the world of policy and practice. This is the world that I inhabit more squarely than the academic world, to be honest. I'm very familiar with the wariness that scholars feel about engaging policymakers. Some of the reasons are justified, some of them. But Michael Jerryson is driven by a desire to make the world a better place, to have an impact. And he understands that the construction of knowledge alone cannot do that if knowledge simply disappears into the ether or an academic journal. And so he steps out into the relative comfort, from the relative comfort of the academy and into those spaces of policy and practice, despite the dangers, the judgments, and the frustrations that come with so doing. He contributes knowledge to nuance or complicate policy-level conversations about Buddhist communities and their relationships to violence and prejudice, while still offering constructive ways forward, policy and practice recommendations. And that is not easy work, my friends. It's not something you're taught to do in the course of getting your PhD. It's not something many academics, certainly not religious scholars, do well. And on top of that, to do so goes against the grain of the guild in many ways. But Michael's willingness and ability to do this, the way he has taught himself to do it, asking the right questions of folks who inhabit the space of policy and practice to know how to do so effectively, is a testament to his drive and his sincere desire to make the world better, including at the grand level of policy. And so he has influenced U.S. policy on Sri Lanka, Swiss government programming that engages the religious sector in southern Thailand, and my own research and work with USIP in Myanmar and beyond. His work has made me a better practitioner, in part because he's engaged me as a practitioner, making his research and analysis relevant to the decisions I must make working for a quasi-governmental organization that works with Theravada Buddhist actors living in conflict. That is no small thing. The last point I want to make about Michael Jerryson and the man and his work, I do as an ordained clergy lady. That's my other hat. I wear a lot of hats. Because I have a big head. Because in Michael, I recognize the work of a minister as much as a scholar when ministry is at its best. When it seeks to really see and be with others in all their complexity and humanness. When it reaches out beyond the parochial to build relationships of mutual care, setting aside ego. When it seeks in all things to do work guided by metta, to make the world a little less insufferable for more people. Because finally, Michael, I believe your biggest contribution has been the way you see people and care for them, and you give of yourself for them. I mean the people who serve as the subjects of your research, as well as your colleagues and your students. You do it with little ego, with no expectation of receiving in return. You do it because you love the people. And you have built a little retinue. I hope you know in this room and beyond, many beyond. So Iselin sends her love from snowy dark Norway, where she was warmed by memories of our epic meal in Zurich in 2014, after we had been instrumentalized by policymakers, which is a risk. And long and deep and meandering conversations of collaborative projects in which you shared generously of your insights and contacts. And just 2 weeks ago in Toronto, Matt Walton and I swapped Michael Jerryson stories. He recounted the care you offered in reviewing his manuscript, or the time you advocated for him to be the first author on your co-authored piece, reflections of your eagerness to offer what authority you've gained in the field to benefit others, especially junior scholars. And I have my own stories of ways you've advocated and supported me, helping to find my own voice as a young scholar. And the more mundane stories of, like, for example, times when I've had a cold when you forced me to go on Amazon and buy really disgusting tasting herbal remedies to try to fix it, which I could use right now. In this, how you check your ego and lift up the work of others, even before your own, and the ways you've supported your students, sought to push for gender justice, or sought to engage and influence policy and practice despite the dangers inherent. You have not always acted like a typical academic, or at least the stereotype of one, thank God. Michael, I can assure you of this, your ministry has and continues to be impactful. You have contributed not only to strengthening subfields of religious studies scholarship, but to the work of policy and practice in very real ways that have very real impacts for people. And I'm certain you will continue to do so. So carry on, Michael Jerryson, and thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's a privilege to be here and to have this opportunity to honor Michael. The way he studies religion, the way he writes, the way he teaches about religion has profoundly inspired my own career as a scholar of religion. But honestly, in some sense, I feel that I don't belong on this panel. I don't study Buddhism, I don't study really anything modern or contemporary, and I don't use ethnographic methods in my research. I actually study pre-modern texts. I study dead people, old things, and things that don't exist anymore. But I think that my perspective is unique because I was Michael's student at Youngstown State, where I completed my bachelor's degree in religious studies. And for anyone who has had the privilege to see Michael teach would, I think, absolutely agree with me that he is a master in the classroom. And I feel that I have a full perspective, having seen him both teach and having read his work. Most importantly for me is Michael's emphasis on religion as something global, something lived, something practiced, something public, but yet at the same time something that's always complicated and compounded by race, class, gender, and so on. This might sound obvious for people who work on stuff that's modern, but it's definitely a challenge for me as someone who studies and teaches about the pre-modern. Because there's a common belief among scholars who work on ancient stuff that you have the modern over here and there's the pre-modern, and these are somehow two separate spheres. And or there's no reason to be political in the classroom if you're teaching about, for example, early Islam or early Christianity, because ancient stuff is supposedly in another world that's separate from our world today. So yeah, that's kind of the prevailing view in my field. And I remember writing my senior capstone for Michael on female gender changes in ancient texts, and I remember him challenging me and him asking me questions like, how are you implicated in this, and how are religious practitioners today implicated in these texts? There's 1.6 million Muslims in the world today, and how is this relevant? So today, as a graduate student, I always ask how I'm implicated in what I teach and what I research. Mm-hmm. So when I teach about Islam in front of a room full of undergraduates in Indiana, which is a very conservative state, and also at a public university, I consider myself to be making a political statement. And there's nothing outside of the public, and there's nothing outside of the political. I may study the past, but I do live in the present, and it's from working with Michael that I learned this, that there's no escaping my present political vantage point. And being honest about my position in the present has opened up many generative possibilities in the text that I read. And in the reading of these texts, I've learned to accept that myself and everyone who reads these texts, we bring our own affects and biases and traumas and projections and feelings of similitude and resonance, and all of these have profound significance for how we read the texts that we study. And in fact, my own dissertation will address this very point. I'm looking at an ancient Christian rhetorical trope against Islam that has persisted throughout the centuries. It has originated in the past, but still exists in the present, and is so laden and bound up with violent and traumatic affects. So this brings me to my next point that I wanted to highlight in regard to Michael's contribution on religion and violence. I think that Michael's work challenges the common thing that we do in religious studies. We have the religion and blank trope, so we say religion and gender, religion and politics, religion and race, religion and sexuality. And in these formulas that we construct, I wonder, what does the and, or sometimes it's an ampersand, what is that doing? So what is the and in religion and violence? Why are religion and violence bound together in the first place? Why is it and? So I guess from one perspective, the and seems to imply that religion and violence somehow enhance or enable or detract from each other. And Michael, who draws on Charles Long's concept of significations, has, I think, shown us that these are not natural or self-evident pairings. Religion and violence are culturally and socially conditioned. Buddhism and peace is not a natural pairing. Islam and violence is not a natural pairing. These pairings become signified and culturally mediated through complex channels that appear as natural. So the "and" in religion and violence, I think, represents that signification. For example, Buddhism and peace, or Islam and violence. I actually taught a lecture to undergraduates where I showed that one of the images on Michael's book where there's a Buddhist, there's a young Buddhist monk holding a gun, and I just kind of left it up there on the screen at the beginning of class, and the students just stared at it just blankly for probably 5 minutes. There was, you could just, I wish I could have taken a picture of their face. They couldn't quite articulate a response. It was this extreme cognitive dissonance. So they actually could not process that.
A paradox at the heart of religion and the human spirit. In a span of only a decade, Michael Jerryson has focused fearlessly and relentlessly on an aspect of the Buddhist tradition that few adherents, observers, and scholars wish to acknowledge or examine. Not the practice of peace, love, compassion, and tolerance, but the persistence of religiously inspired hatred, war, violence, and genocide in the lands where Buddhism has taken root, spread, and flourished. Since the publication of his first monograph in 2008 on the Mongolian genocide and the decimation of the Buddhist Sangha, Michael has published books on Buddhist violence in Thailand and the roots of Buddhist violence in the history and politics of South and Southeast Asia. He's edited volumes more generally on religion and violence, and this summer offered testimony before the Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organization of the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs. On his home campus of Youngstown State University, he is a revered and beloved professor of religion and humanities. Joining the Peace Corps in 1997, Michael chose Mongolia as his field site to learn more about the Buddhism that nearly disappeared in the 30s under Soviet occupation. A few years later, he embarked on his doctoral studies in what he calls the Deep South of Thailand, the provinces that abut Malaysia and are home to the majority ethnic Malay Muslim population. He wanted to observe the ways in which Buddhist monks affected the violence initiated by the Thai government against the Muslim majority and how the violence affected the monks in turn. He said this led me to a larger discussion of Buddhist roles in violence and the more recent conflicts between Buddhists and non-Buddhists in Thailand, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, as he explained recently in an interview for the Association of Asian Studies, which is online. Lots of good stuff about you online. In the introduction to Buddhist Fury, the book that grew out of his dissertation, Jerryson recounts the personal dangers he faced in 2004 as he began his interviews with 20 abbots from 8 districts, or about 22% of the Buddhist leaders in the province. He was one of only 3 Farang, or Caucasians, in the area. Because he shopped in Muslim groceries for his kosher diet, he began to raise suspicions among the Buddhists. Whose side was he on during this ongoing civil war? Rumors spread that he was an agent of the CIA. Graduate students suddenly refused to help with the interview translations, and the Muslim Malays wondered if he was sympathetic to the policies of the Bush administration. He started to say that he was a Canadian until a colleague warned him that a professional hit was out on the American masquerading as a Canadian. A quick ride to the local airport took him to Bangkok, where he finished his interviews by phone and returned to the U.S. I love that story. 2 years later, with better Thai language skills, he returned to southern Thailand to complete his field work. For 2 years, he conducted his own interviews, now keeping the visits short, staying in temples, moving frequently, and avoiding public venues. Throughout this time, he recalls, I suffered what I later learned was ASD, acute stress disorder. However, due to my precautions, I did not have encounters with locals like I had back in 2004. These episodes of Michael's early career remind us of the difference between scholars whose work takes them to libraries and archives on campus and those who choose the roads far less traveled. I'm not going to offer a survey of the many insights and discoveries that Michael has contributed to our understanding of Buddhism and violence during his meteoric career. Rather, I'd like to reflect briefly on the differences that bring each of us to the study of religion or perhaps more specifically, the study of Buddhism. I would like to raise the question that I wrestle with when I spend time with the growing literature on religion and violence, or as I sometimes call it in case of Buddhism, Buddhism Breaking Bad. Granted, every religion has skeletons in the closet and practitioners that fail to live up to the ideals of the Gospel, the Dhamma, the Torah, or the Quran. But the vast majority of Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and Jews over the centuries have been law-abiding at a minimum and devout and aspirational at best, attempting to discern and embody the teachings of founders and elders of the faith. But I wonder what it would be like to focus full-time on the violence that has dogged a tradition from the start. Michael Jerryson is certainly not the first scholar to turn in this direction and remain focused there. Some of the landmark works over the past 40 years, Trevor Ling's Buddhism, Imperialism, and War, Stanley Tambai's Buddhism Betrayed, Brian Victoria's Zen at War, Mark Juergensmeyer's Terror in the Mind of God, and a flood of titles Oxford has published from the pens of Jerryson, Juergensmeyer, and Kitts over the past few years. Since the 1980s, I've been studying what might be considered the polar opposite of violence in religion studies, namely engaged Buddhist studies, focusing on the nonviolent liberation movements we associate with the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dalit Buddhist human rights movement in India, Sarvodaya Shramadana village development movement in Sri Lanka, the International Women's Movement for Buddhist Ordination, and scores of peace, justice, and environmental movements in the West. In thinking about Michael's work and pondering the ordeals he survived to document the violence of monks who were themselves drowning in a sea of violence, I wrote to our mutual friend, Steve Jenkins, who wrote a masterful dissertation on Buddhist compassion years ago, but who has turned to the textual sources of Buddhist violence in recent years. Why does Michael do this? And why do you do this, Steve? Did you run out of texts on loving kindness and compassion? Here's what he said. Regarding why Michael would focus on violence, I think it's important for everyone to try to understand and resolve violent situations throughout the Buddhist world. The press just goes, eek, violent Buddhists, how shocking. What's left to know except the apparent hypocrisy? That definitely supports the religion critics. Steve continues, we may not like it, but warfare is a form of engaged Buddhism. I hated hearing that. For my part, I think Buddhists have an ethic of violent conflict that is worth studying, and that we deprive them of credit for those values with the powerful Orientalist projection that they are all simple pacifists. They never were, historically or in principle, especially in Burma, where they are doing today, what they are doing today is way less distant from their values than people think. Tibetan youth actually think Buddhist pacifism lost them their country. Seriously? Pacifist Tibet? Steve goes on, but I'm going to shorten this. So why do we choose one focus over another in our careers as scholars of religion? The answers are likely very personal for each of us. I'm the son of a Methodist minister who was a lifelong pacifist. Yet my brother went into the military and hasn't spoken to the family for nearly 20 years. Michael's Jewish heritage may have something to do with his determination to expose genocide and state-sponsored violence, as well as the social and spiritual transformations it exacts on its victims and bystanders. Whatever the motives and influences that guide us into one subspecialty or of academic concentration or another, I worry that we risk losing ourselves in that world of questions and possible answers. When I scanned the AAR catalog for sessions to attend, I found myself looking for my friends and topics that reflect my own narrow concerns. Both Michael and I once opened articles with reference to a self-immolating monk. Thich Quan Duc, in my case, the monk who burned himself on a Saigon street corner in 1963, opened the introduction to engaged Buddhism in Asia, and the 18-year-old Tibetan monk Khalsang Wangdu, who protested Chinese control of his country in 2016, opens Michael's chapter on Buddhism, War, and Violence in the new Oxford Handbook of Buddhist Ethics. Yet in spite of this coincidence, written 22 years apart, neither of us has paid more than passing notice of the other engaged Buddhisms that deserve attention. In his book on religion and violence in southern Thailand, for example, there is no mention of Sulat Sivaraksa, the Thai Buddhist public intellectual and peace activist who's gone to jail numerous times for this, founder of the International Network of Engaged Buddhists. Similarly, in my volumes on engaged Buddhism in Asia and the West, little attention is paid to the ubiquity of Buddhist-inspired violence in Asia and the liberal, elitist underpinnings of Buddhist activism in the West, which creates its own epistemological violence in its disregard for those who do not hold liberal values. Mu Song, the senior resident scholar at the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies, also offered me his opinion on the growing field of violence studies in Buddhism and other religions. He says there needs to be a balance in what we do. I write on Buddhist philosophy and the interface of Buddhist and science, but I also know that the great majority of Buddhists live in places where there isn't much opportunity to study these things. I grew up in India. I studied Korean Zen in the West, but I know that conditions are like for the followers of Ambedkar, who, like him, grew up untouchable, but unlike him, have remained subject to lynchings in the villages, unemployment and homelessness in the cities, and bullying in the schools. The violence is there, and it's not always limited to the bullies. There's fighting back, too. The Dalit Panthers had their run in the 1970s. So if we focus only on the violence and war that is justified by Buddhists in crisis, do we risk giving aid and comfort to the enemies of religion? As Steve Jenkins said, when we learn of situations like the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya people in Myanmar, egged on by fundamentalist Buddhist clergy, what's left to know except the apparent hypocrisy? Take your pick, Dawson's, Hitchens, Dennett, Pinker. Here's what Sam Harris had to say about in his vitriolic letter to a Christian nation. Religion raises the stakes of human conflict much higher than tribalism, racism, or politics ever can, and it is the only form of in-group, out-group thinking that casts the differences between people in terms of eternal rewards and punishments. Harris goes on to sharpen his knife to the point that the worldviews, comforts, identity, and ethical dialogues offered by religion, which are cited often and clearly by Michael Jerryson and most scholars of religion, are sliced up as the dangerous fantasies of humans capable of reason and kindness, but blinded by religion. Perhaps in the end, the balance of idealism and realism, or realpolitik, that we seek in the study of Buddhism or other religions are rarely found in any one scholar, and those who study the social engagement of nonviolent movements need to listen to those who take the risks and suffer the acute stress disorder that goes with the study of violent engagements in the name of religion. Their attention to the liberation movements, disaster relief societies, prison ministries, animal rescue leagues, and environmental reclamation programs that we study, also in the name of religion, will help to balance the bad news from the battlefronts of ethnic and religious war. In Michael Jerryson, we have a stalwart champion and brave ally in this quest. He understands the balance, even as he stares more deeply into the social conditions and historical teachings that beget violence and suffering around the world. We are enriched by your work, Michael, and we will continue to learn from the journeys you have made beyond the safety of the library, the comforts of the campus, and the misleading tropes of fading textbooks. Thank you.
A lot of studies in many ways. In the memoirs of Buddhism and violence, long before many of the rest of us were forced to look at this as a vector of analysis or begin to work seriously about what this meant for our understanding of what it meant to be Buddhist or how Buddhism was constructed in the places we work. He drew attention to connections and comparisons between how violence is constructed differently in different Buddhist spaces. And I think in many ways, much of his contribution is maybe what you could say is the best possible aspects of comparison, and the sense that he helps us see a contrast and connections between Buddhist violence in different places. The ways in which violence operates in the southern Thailand is different than the ways in which it works in Rakhine State and a broader anti-Muslim discourse elsewhere in Sri Lanka. But I think he helps us understand the connections that happen in those locations. And so bringing out the contrast actually gives us these insights about how things operate. And I also think it helps us understand the interconnections between it, the ways in which Buddhism and violence, or the violence what's happening in Buddhist places is interconnected about larger discourses of perceptions of Buddhism and constructions of Buddhism in those places, but also how it intersects with larger discourses. So thinking about Rakhine State right now, thinking largely about an internationalist anti-migrant discourse colliding with a local anti-migrant discourse, and an anti-Muslim discourse colliding with a larger international anti-Muslim discourse. I think Michael's work, far from dismissing Buddhism as pacifist or allowing any sort of facile construction like this, he works to open up the questions and challenges us to look at locally conflicted concepts of harm, how it is that Buddhism is constructed, harm is constructed, and violence is constructed in each of these places. I think, importantly, he's opened up the questions of where religion, and especially where Buddhism resides within the problems that we look at. The possibility of challenging us to not look simply towards doctrine, towards text, even towards ritual or performance, but to think that Buddhism in the Buddhist violence we're looking at may reside in other opportunity or other aspects of this. I think particularly has helped shatter the concept, the construction of Buddhism as tolerant, Buddhism as peaceful, and open up the possibilities for having ourselves ask ourselves, how has that been constructed over time? How have we come to that in this particular place, in this particular conflict? More than this, he's demonstrated how paying attention to Buddhism and violence requires that we examine how Buddhism is constructed, both in our own discourses, our academic discourses, but also how it's locally constructed by the actors in the sets of conflicts that we look at. In some of this, he has some work on post-exceptionalism that's been particularly helpful and insightful for me. Also the postscript to When You Meet the Buddha, he suggests we look at the position of monks and the authority of monks as itself as the location of Buddhism and the ways in which they operate as a vector for Buddhism within this discourse of violence. I'm interested here not just in the implications of studying anti-Muslim discourse in Burma, obviously this is exactly where we intersect, but also because I think it draws our attention to culture and vectors of authority in the operations of these things. If the questions of what is Buddhist about this discourse that's inciting violence, the answer might not lie in content or in the justification or the cosmology or those larger things we're used to looking at. It may simply be in the mode of transmission and the authority through which it operates. And in this, I begin to think that I'd be really interested to sort of engage that postscript more, in part because of some of the revelations that come out more recently about the ways in which the violence that's operated in Rakhine State. For a long time, our interlocutors and Burmese friends have tried to say, well, the military is behind this. And I think a lot of us resisted trying to say this because out of an ethical stance, we wanted to say, no, you need to be introspective. This discourse of violence is much broader. It's through the culture. It's pervasive. But actually, and that part is certainly true. The monks have been a vector of violence and the authority through which they operate. But what has come out more recently is that there actually are other vectors. We've long known how Facebook has operated to spread this level of hatred, but we've also come to know now that the Burmese military was using a particular psychological warfare operations. They were creating fake Facebook accounts to flow this. And so out of this particular operation by the military then, the questions of where the location of Buddhism in this violence, this discourse of violence operates, I was reading that last chapter, thinking about those questions, and actually thinking about the ways in which that wasn't a problem when you wrote it, but actually that chapter opens up all of those possibilities because we think about the location of Buddhism and the flow of authority through a much broader sense of medium and levels of transmission. And where Buddhism is in each of those things, in fake Facebook accounts, in military going to Russia to learn how to set up fake Facebook accounts and such things. I think Michael's work in particular, he has a knack for patiently deconstructing the facile equations of Buddhism and peace, Buddhism and tolerance that pervades public discourse. And that's a patience not all of us have or share. There are some of us not cut out for talking to policy people. But that skill does something in the world, and I have great admiration for it, because you've been able to do that where the rest of us can't.
and to translate that is something huge. I'm also deeply, deeply grateful that his work, at the same moment as looking at militaristic violence, puts structural violence next to it and asks about the role of structural violence, both in the militaristic violence itself, but also in the larger Buddhist context. His focus on identity in his written work and created space to think about violence with larger structures. I was recently at a Buddhist ethics conference focused on race, class, and gender, and he was it was wonderful to be there with his comments because I was thinking at one point, he's the person whose written work actually engages these things at a clear level with talking about violence more broadly. And that each of these aspects of structural violence was there in his conversations already. But I also think his dedication to thinking about the ways in which structural violence operates, gendered violence, the violence of class politics, and the violence of identity and ethnicity, it goes well beyond the sort of written academic work that he's brought together. So we had long conversations about the gendered and class-structured nature of academic work that were clear to me informed his reflections on Buddhist context. And more than that, it's clear in his practice and his life that these are dedications. He's one of the few cisgendered men I know who's clear about his pronouns in all places. You can't write him an email without creating a space that is open to queer folks and transgendered people. And that is to be appreciated in a public place. That doesn't happen in Buddhist studies, let's be clear. And it's an important thing. So creating these spaces where everyone is possible. And more than that, so if his Facebook account is to be believed, and I don't have some Burmese military fake Facebook account for you, you're also clearly currently in a local fight to make sure there's a women's center and to create spaces within your own campus for that. So in this, I think I want to highlight that Michael works as a role model of ethical engaged scholarship. As we've said, he does to his subjects, he gives Buddhists the respect of being critical and not sympathetic. So to be critical of Buddhist violence itself, to be critical of the discourses that's there, rather than repeating and acting as a sympathizer. He's a person who took stance in his scholarship from the beginning. His ethical positions are clear in the content of his work and his uncompromising stances. Not only has he been prolific, which a lot of us are deeply jealous of and don't understand how that works, but he's taken risks in his scholarship, and clearly personal risks. He's taken risks of being banned from his field sites, of being banned from speaking, but he's also seems to be quite clear in his written work that the risks that he takes are minor compared to the risks of his informants. And that too is an ethical position. But I also think his ethical engagement is there in his practice of scholarship. He's engaged in lots of collaborative work that helps bring other voices to the table. And it's clear in what I've seen and interacted with, he's wonderful about welcoming young scholars and scholars of Asian descent. There's a lot of background work that happens in academia. If it's done well, you never ever see it. But it is the work of supporting someone and helping them bring forth their argument, of collaborating and carefully helping a young scholar come to a voice. And I've seen him do this. So his work of being collaborative and helpful has grown the field in this way. And I think its implications are much broader than we might see otherwise. So I just want to say I'm honored to be here and that I'm really pleased to be able to comment.
Eric Davis.
Hi everyone, I'm Eric Davis, Callister College, and like everyone else, I am deeply honored to have been invited to join this panel in honor of Michael Jerryson. I was not entirely certain why I was invited, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. When I think about why was I invited, I was thinking, well, okay, so I do ethnography, sort of. I do some Buddhism stuff. I am in Southeast Asia. Also, Michael and I share some activist-y sort of interests and outside of the academy things in some ways. And I'm trying to think, well, golly, what do I do here? Because I don't write about Buddhism and violence, really. I don't actually bring my politics too much. I'm not a public scholar. And so what I want to talk about is the ways in which Michael is completing or making it possible for me to not complete my work and still feel whole. All right. So I'll tell you that story by telling you that I grew up partly on a small farmhouse in southern Minnesota. It was not our farm. My dad was a pastor. We got the house. And because we were isolated, my mom didn't know what to do with me. I probably maybe have undiagnosed ADHD, so that may have something to do with it. At one day, she couldn't take me anymore, and she gave me a spade, and she sent me out next to the cornfield and said, dig. And inside of about 4.5 hours, I dug something that was about, so if you get the analogy of what a trailer, you know what a double wide trailer is, it would have been a double wide grave. And I just had that much time to do, and I dug my own little hole, and I didn't know what I was doing with it. It wasn't very connected to anything else, and I didn't know what I was going to catch. The next day, I caught a combine. A combine came through and fell in the hole. So there were consequences to what I had done, but they weren't planned, and they weren't connected to other things. What I really like about what Michael's work does in his own life and what it makes it possible for me to do is to make connections that make my own ditch digging seem to make more sense. And so here's the way that works out in practical reality for me. I don't write about Buddhism and violence. That's not the work I do. I'm interested in Buddhism and violence because I'm interested, as was so eloquently said earlier, about Michael's orientation, I'm interested in suffering. And I think Michael's orientation towards suffering has been one of the most consistent, critical, honest, and cohering things that I can see in his career, and which has made, when I say cohering, I don't just mean cohering his career, it helps cohere mine, and that's the theme I want to run with, right? Is that he's helping cohere mine, because I don't do that work. For whatever reason, I fire on a bunch of different cylinders all at the same time, and none of them seem to tie together. I go to work, and I do my teaching, and I go do my activism stuff elsewhere, and I have kids, and I do that stuff, you know, and they're all just kind of parallel. What it looks like from the outside, and I'm sure it's a lie, I'm sure I am not seeing Yakabutam, I'm not seeing the world the way it really is that Michael seems to have known from the beginning that he had an orientation, he had a set of interests, he had a way in which he was going to approach the topics that he cared about, and that this caring was not in separate planes, the way mine so often feels. This caring sort of connected these various parts and dimensions of his life in a way that was really meaningful. And when I started teaching, I got a job in 2007, and I knew I wanted to do, I was teaching Intro to Buddhism. What do you do during the graduates teaching Intro to Buddhism? What can I teach them? Well, the ability to blow up the idea that Buddhism is all these things that everyone else has already covered, right? Is this, pacifistic, beautiful. I mean, you kind of imagine Mickey Mouse in sort of robes, and it's like, who's going to hurt anybody? And, it's this lovely thing, and it's completely, he completely throws it apart. The idea of showing the monk with a gun on the cover of the book and just watching students' responses, there's a real power to being able to explode that preconception. And when I have been able to bring Michael's work, and I have taught, because of Michael's work, I have taught the work of many other people on this panel, and that is the order in which that happened, is that I started with Michael's work and then started bringing other people in as things developed. He made it possible for me to bring those concerns and those interests into the classroom in a way that I would not have been able to on my own. And that class is definitely the most popular class I teach. It's the class that people walk away going, wow, I didn't realize Buddhism was actually, a religion. I didn't know people did, like there was humans in there. I didn't know that was a thing, right? And so it's always been extremely important to me when I think about sort of the work Michael does, is how, at least from the outside, it seems so coherent and so precise and so unitary. And it makes what is my own internal experience of separation between the different parts of my lives. Michael, you complete me. Okay? And so if I was going to return to my garden, that ditch I dug, right? I was actually finally managed to go back to that village. It's a village about 3 years ago, and somebody else is growing a garden there, and it's actually growing things. But there's a weird shape inside that garden where things are growing a little better than the rest of the stuff. And I didn't do any of the planting in there. And I didn't do any of the selection of the seeds or the weeding or the watering. I didn't have any control over the sun. But I did some of the work there a long time ago. And that made it possible for somebody else to do even better work, which made somebody eating vegetables. I was never going to grow those vegetables. I clearly didn't have the skill. But what I want to sort of connect that to here is the way in which Michael's work has made my work possible and made my work more unitary and my life more unitary in a way that I find very complimentary and for which I'm very, very grateful. Michael came to visit McAllister and talk in 2015 in the winter. It was a very, very, very bad winter. Now maybe coming from Youngstown, it wasn't a big deal, but you know, it was a bad winter, and he came and talked about Buddhism and fascism and politics to my students, and it was very reassuring. It was very reassuring to watch somebody else say things in a way that felt more academically supported and valid and authoritative than the stuff I had been sort of repeating at my students through the semester. And it made it possible for me to continue teaching in the way that I do. So Michael, you've had a huge influence on my teaching. To the extent that my students have had any influence from me, you've had a huge influence on them. And you have made my ability to conceptualize the weird multiplanar aspects of my own life as connected in a way that I find extremely helpful. Thank you so much.
Michael, before you stand up, I'd like to ask Jamel Belgi to say a word or two. Jamel is my co-conspirator in putting this panel together and has worked with Michael as the coordinator and co-coordinator of this unit for a while. Jamel, thank you for your role in putting this panel together and for working with Mike. You just stand up there if you wish. You don't have to come up in front.
Let me come up.
Okay. We've established Jamel is shy around the ladies, but not shy in front of the classroom. So.
Taking Eric's cue, I also have to tell everybody about how Michael completes me. Many years ago, when we were in graduate school together, Michael said, you know, you should really ask out. There's this woman, Chloe, and I was like, no, I don't know if I'm too shy. Hence Mark says I'm shy around the ladies. How did we get so off topic? Buddhism, violence, and Michael. And I was like, no. And he's like, no, yes, you should do it. And we are now, 13 years into our marriage. So I have to publicly acknowledge Michael Jerryson. But the real reason... I'm very shy around her. But the real ostensible reason I'm here is to talk about my role with Michael as being co-chair of the Comparative Approaches and Religion Violence unit at the American Academy of Religion. And I just want to highlight 3 really amazing things that I learned about working with Michael over the past 3 years as co-chair of this unit with him, many of which have been said before. But the first thing is that I noted immediately within the first 2 weeks that Michael has this dogged dedication and commitment to illuminating the suffering of lesser-known communities and undoing these dominant narratives. This is really, really critical to his being. And I have seen this in the ways in which he also encourages graduate students and others to submit across a wide range of topics pushing the geographical envelope. The more geographically diverse, the more focus on the global south, the more we can compare, the more we can make this a human phenomenon, all the better. And Michael has a real dedication to this. The second thing I want to mention is his commitment toward mentoring graduate students. Graduate students in particular who submit proposals to the AAR conference are frequently clueless as to what they are doing. And Michael will be one of the few people who gets over email and sends these like long emails. It's like, in order to make your presentation proposal better, I would encourage the following. And you read these documents and they're just beautiful. And you realize, like, how is this guy so prolific, as somebody said? I mean, he's writing these books and then he's writing these long emails. And many people write back and say, I have never seen anybody do this for me, and thank you. The third thing is that he is a superlative administrator. I don't know if you people know him as this, but he is, this is weird to me, because he's doing all of these things, but he can also keep track of like 15 different threads. And this is all, I mean, I should show you my inbox. Every week I get 10 to 15 bulk messages from Michael. Each of the emails have different subjects. And then he'll follow up like 2 weeks later, do we do this, do we do this, do we do this? And I'm like, no. And weren't you supposed to do that? And he's like, no, it's you. And so, thank you, Michael.
I suppose since we have a few minutes, if anyone else who is not on the panel want to add a word, this is probably a good time to do it. You don't need to come up to this microphone, you can just stand where you are. But not seeing, there's a hand. All right, yes, originally we had hoped you would say something.
Hi everyone. I'm one of those non-traditional students who I was honored to be on a panel with Dr. Jerryson, and his feedback completely changed the scope of my career, honestly. I was one of those kids that I was 15 and I was a high school dropout, right? I was a gang member. I have both my parents are felons. I didn't really have a future, right? And when I got into academia, I had a lot of trouble trying to figure out how to write and put things together because I've never had any kind of, teaching. And I'm sorry, I'm emotional. And Dr. Jerryson, along with my incredible mentors, where I went to school at Florida International University, they've molded me into being someone who was willing to go into the field, and maybe that's the gangster in me, right? I was willing to work with terrorists and do things that were so brave, but it was really just modeling after him and following his example and being encouraged by someone who was so respected and introduced me to language that I never thought I would ever be able to not reproduce, but hopefully one day reproduce. So thank you for existing.
Thank you for those comments. Yes, Festus.
I remember the first day when Michael walked into my office and said, I'm done with Mongolia. And I want
And he said that to you, of all people.
He said, I really want to work something on engage Buddhism, Southeast Asia. I said, Michael, I don't know, this is not my area. I was very apprehensive. I said, well, we need to find somebody for you to lead you in this direction. And it was wonderful to see this development, he was traveling. And I remember when Michael was going to Thailand first time, he came also to my office. He says, I may not come back. I may die, be shot there. So please make sure that they don't bring my body back. because it will cost them lots of money. So my parents, they can just tell them to leave my body there. And I was like, you know what to do with this. This was like a big responsibility. But it showed how dedicated he was. And Michael was not one of the most diligent. He was the most diligent student I have had in 20 years at UCSB. And somehow he was so balanced. He was a great husband, really loving husband. And he was also great humanitarian. Even then, I remember Michael going on vacations to visit his parents, and he would go and do humanitarian work with them. He said, "This is what my family believes." So he seems like he never took a break. And whatever he did it in such a wonderful, gracious, wholesome ways.
Great, thank you, Esther. Anyone else like to add a comment? Yes, Ben. Stand up so we can hear you.
So I'm Ben Philpott. I known Michael for a while. Santa Barbara, a little behind him. If you think it was intimidating to teach him, it was like to be behind him. And then behind him my whole career and watching as he did things. I think everyone in this room, just about our vintage, has stood in some admiration. And a lot of what I've heard today, I do the tip of the iceberg, and I just want to acknowledge how overwhelming it is to hear how remarkable you are in all aspects of your life. Obviously, that plus. Just also just add a note that of the scholars I know who do this kind of work, put themselves in harm's way, write things that might be taken different ways. Not many of us can do that. Even those of us who think we can speak to policymakers, we don't have the courage a lot of the time. And something that, besides being the most diligent person I've ever met as well, you're, I think, the scholar that I think of that's got the most courage of anybody I know. And I just want to say that in the room and to say I'm still just now even more in admiration of everything you've done, man. So, you.
Like Ben, I thought I'd known everything there was to know about you, Michael, but in this panel I've learned so much more. You know, Michael, this was supposed to be a panel to review your scholarship. And it turned out to be increasingly a panel to discuss you as a person. And then I realized that in your case, the two are so closely intertwined that you can't talk about Michael the scholar without talking about him as a person. You can't talk about Michael the person without his scholarship, his intellectual curiosity. And what a compliment that is, to be able to say that about something. So we're all fans of yours, Michael, and we're so proud to be a part of this panel and to give you an opportunity now to have a word of your own. Please come.
It's hard not to be emotional. Eric, you had me at ADHD. But it's amazing how when you hear others talk about yourself, you see yourself in a prison in a way you've never seen yourself before, and it almost makes you tongue-tied. And it reminds me of hearing an interview with Daniel Kahneman. He's an acclaimed psychologist who had problems too hearing this, but he talked about the fact that his success was largely due to luck, and luck in terms of collaborations. And he said the world is not kind to collaborators. And I think he's very true with that. I was very lucky, for example, at the beginning of my PhD, and this is terrible to say this, 9/11 happened, and I got a chance to work with Mark because of that. There was an open, suddenly, TA-ship, and I came in that way into global studies. And I was lucky to have a faculty member who, when it came down to helping me with Buddhist warfare, and Marcus and I were co-editing it, he turned to the publisher at the time, the Oxford, and he says, "No, I don't need the royalties for this. Let Michael have it." I mean, you hear these terrible stories about faculty, senior faculty that just take, graduate students' work and make it their own. And I had the opposite in a mentor in ways like this.
And they wouldn't let me do it. They tried to take my name off it.
Eric Davis talked about the focus on suffering. Many of you did talk about this, and I know, Chris, you're asking about the question of origins for this too. Where does it come from? And this is also, I also share with Daniel Kahneman this idea that I think it's a mistake to start looking into why we can make people more happy. I don't think our job is to figure out ways to make people more happy. I think our job is to figure out how we can minimize suffering, which is a very different thing. And the origin of this, I think, perhaps we could say, because of my background, I'm not Jewish anymore. I actually got excommunicated my senior year in high school from that. But, that's a long story. Anyway, I think growing up Jewish granted me the ability to see what it was like to not be included in U.S. society in a normative way. We hear about this with other people too, so it gave you that glimpse. But really, for me, if I have to reflect back on what gave me the fuel for this, and this is kind of morbid in some ways. I remember when I was 3 years old, and my mother has cases of clinical depression, and she was on the couch and she couldn't move, and she was asking for help with this 3-year-old, and I was just very young, and I realized at that point that I wanted to help her, but I couldn't. My mother was suffering, and I couldn't do anything about it. And that, I think, inability drove me to focus more on people's sufferings and trying to help them. In so many ways, I think what happens in our early childhood begins to germinate and grow in different directions. And I think that's happened very much with me in this case. I appreciate Alicia's comments about the postscript. In many ways, Alicia, you started me on this path too. We were at a Association of Asian Studies conference, and people were wondering what was going on in Myanmar at the time. Alicia was on a panel, and she says, "You guys don't understand. The biggest argument in Burmese Buddhism was not about doctrine. It was about, how to wear your robes. It was about ritual." And people were like, "What?" And it was a great way of reframing, thinking of things beyond what we call orthodoxy or doctrine, getting beyond that. And it got me thinking more about authority, whether it's in ritual, or if it's in culture, or if it's in doctrine. And I think it's a play of all three. And in the same way, too, I like the honoring the focus on structural violence. I've actually had to fight to keep structural violence in my work. My last work, my recent one on If You Meet the Buddha on the Road, one of the reviewers wrote back saying, gender discrimination, blasphemy, that's not violence. This shouldn't be in the book. That's different. And I wrote back to the publisher saying, look, I appreciate that point of view, but I just strongly disagree. I think some of these issues of violence are more pervasive, discrimination, whether it's racial, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. And they undergird not on just a personal level, but on a societal level. It's there, it's everywhere. It permeates into warfare and conflict. In many ways, too, I think our focus on war and conflict is a very Western, almost masculine way of looking at violence. It ignores this domestic abuse, other things taking place. And I really believe structural violence needs to be front and center. It was interesting at that Buddhist ethics conference, too. We had the same issue where some people were thinking, why should we focus on gender? It's like this ethics conference. I'm like, because it's so important. Because discrimination is so important to look at. Violence is not just simply about guns and knives. But the thing that's lost too, I think I realized in all my studies, is that whether we like it or not, violence is a form of agency. And I learned that from Ashish Nandi's work. It's a way of making yourself feel heard. And I think that point's so important now, because when all other avenues of our voices are blocked, we turn to violence as a means of being heard. And I disagree with people arguing that we're in the age of anger. No, we're in the age of fear right now. And if we don't listen to people's fears, they will take their agency in a different direction. They'll take it to violence. So it's important to listen. Whether we agree with them or not, listen to the fears. Listen to fears reduces how much fear you have. dismissing fear increases it. And it converts to anger, it converts to hatred in this way. And we see this. I mean, I live close to Pittsburgh, and right, with Bauer's attack on the horrific attack on synagogue and 11 dead, and listening to the rhetoric, it mirrors so much whether it's Dylan Roof or others talking, and they're coming out of places of fear. And so, whether we like it or not, I think we need to understand and have them realize that we're hearing their fear and work in ways to try to reframe and discuss things. I gave a talk at a retirement community recently on Islamophobia, and I put up there statistics about deaths, murders in the United States, and it was like something like, I don't know if you've seen this before, it's a really interesting way of looking at our focus on violence. So about 2 to 3 Americans have died a year from jihadists at the most. And it was like 9 Americans from non-Muslim people that are terrorists, like Bowers just fulfilled that with making it 11 already, right, this year. But then it gets another statistics, like people died from lawnmowers, much higher. People get hit by like lightning, much higher. People fall out of bed. It's like over 700 people died from each shift in bed. And then, of course, the last statistic is over 11,000 people die in the United States each year from guns and from shooting. And I showed this, and of course, some people were like, well, what this? Well, no. And I had someone come up to me afterwards, and she was in her 60s, and she's lived in the community for a long time. She said, Dr. Jerryson, I don't understand, though, because Islam's a threat. I mean, Dearborn, Michigan, they're trying to create Sharia law here, and I'm so worried about it. And I brought back to things like, you're right, there is issues of ISIS, there's issues of recruits. So I understand that fear. I mean, what do you think about the statistics I brought up, about the amount of fear? Does it resonate with you that you should be that fearful about Muslim terrorists when it comes to these other statistics? And she paused, and she's thinking, well, yeah, it doesn't make sense. And so to be able to first hear her and then reframe it, I found was a very productive way of doing things. And I feel blessed to have been given these privileges. I think being male, being white, it gave me a foot up in ways that others didn't, to be able to get the education, to get the interviews, to get the appointments to do this. And I think, as others have said, I think we have privilege. It's important to speak out for those who don't. Erica mentioned, he doesn't know why, perhaps he was invited on the panel. When Mark asked me for people that I would like to have on the panel, I was like, well, you shouldn't ask me. But I think it was people I admired for various reasons. Chris's work on engaged Buddhism, starting on the path of looking at engagement in these ways. Susan's work is, I think, tireless, and her perseverance working for the greater good, even though Congress, she's the whim of Congress, and the little money they put towards your work. And of course, how much she has to cover in Southeast Asia alone is incredible. Alicia Turner with her journal studies and always working to link and help other junior faculty out and graduate students, incredible, And Abby's meteoric rise in Indiana, or Eric Davis's. Davis's work with Death Power is so trenchant, insightful. His wit is, you could probably get a sense of it just from his talk. So that's why I guess part of the reasons why I gave that list there, and I so appreciate this opportunity and feel very humbled by these words. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Michael, and thank all of you for being a part of this very special occasion. Take care and go out and read all of his works. There's a book site right at present. The latest, of course, is If You Meet Buddha on the Road, and all of you Buddhist scholars know the rest of that quote. Thank you, Michael, for everything you've done, and thank all of you for being here. Good night.